The streets of the city buzzed with the usual haste, cars honking, people shuffling past, their faces buried in the glowing screens of their phones. But for John, it was all a blur. He had seen enough of this world. The world of metal and glass, of constant motion, of hurried footsteps that never seemed to pause for a second. He had fought for this world once, bled for it, and now, here he was, walking through it like a ghost. The sound of his crutches striking the pavement was the only thing that broke through the noise of the city. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was a constant reminder of his new reality. He wasn't the man he used to be. John had returned from the war a long time ago, but it felt as though he had never really come home. His body, scarred and weary, carried the weight of everything he had seen and lost. He had survived battles no one could imagine, and yet in the eyes of those who now passed him by, he was just another crippled black man, invisible to a world that had long since forgotten his sacrifice. His uniform was long gone, replaced by a faded jacket and a cap that did little to shield him from the bitter wind. But the truth was, the uniform had never been the symbol of his strength. It was the man who had worn it, the warrior, the leader, the one who stood tall even when his body was broken. Today, however, the warrior had a new plan, a new purpose, a chance to prove that he was more than just a relic of the past. John adjusted the crutches under his arms, his grip tightening. He had come to make a statement. He wasn't just some forgotten veteran struggling to get by. No, he was more, much more. The bank stood ahead, its towering glass facade gleaming in the sun, a monument to power and wealth. It was the kind of place that only the privileged entered, a place where deals were made behind closed doors, where the rich grew richer and the poor remained invisible. But John was not here as a beggar. No, he was here as an equal, a man who had played the game from the inside, a man who, despite everything the world had thrown at him, had clawed his way to the top. He had bought shares, a lot of shares, enough to make him one of the largest stakeholders in the very institution that had long been the epitome of everything he had fought against. And today, he was going to use that power. As he approached the entrance, the guards at the door barely glanced up. They saw a man with crutches, a man who didn't belong here. Tap, tap, tap. He could feel their eyes on him, judging him before he even spoke a word. The familiar sting of racism, the subtle disdain of someone who didn't fit into their world. But John didn't flinch. He had learned long ago not to let their hatred touch him. Not today. "I'm here to speak with someone about my shares," he said, his voice steady, but there was a cold fire burning behind his words. The guard looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Shares?" The man's voice was dismissive, as if John's very presence was an inconvenience. "You're not on the list. You'll have to leave." John's jaw tightened. He didn't expect anything different. He had known this would happen, but he hadn't come all this way just to turn around. "I don't think you understand," John said, his voice dropping an octave. "I own part of this bank. I have the right to be here." For a moment, the guard hesitated, confusion flashing across his face. But it was brief. The guard's hand was already moving toward the radio on his belt, and that was when John knew. He wasn't going to be allowed in, not like this, not with his crutches, not with his skin. The tension in the air thickened, suffocating him, as the guard spoke into the radio, his eyes flickering with a mix of contempt and suspicion. "Sir, you need to leave. We can't allow you in without proper authorization." John's eyes burned with fury, but he forced himself to stay calm. "They think they can push me around. They think they can toss me aside because of who I am." The guard's hand moved, signaling for him to step aside. But John wasn't going anywhere, not this time, not without making them understand. "I am the authorization," he said, stepping forward, his crutches striking the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty lobby. And then, just like that, everything changed. John stood tall, his crutches digging into the polished floor like a declaration of defiance. The bank lobby, sleek and sterile, hummed with the low murmur of distant voices and the subtle clicking of high heels on marble. Yet all of it seemed miles away as John's gaze met the cold, indifferent eyes of the guard. The moment hung in the air, charged with the kind of tension that only existed in places where power and privilege were worshipped. "You need to leave now," the guard said, his voice low, almost dismissive. John's heart pounded in his chest, not from fear, but from a sense of righteous anger. He had lived his life being underestimated, humiliated, and disregarded by people who thought they were better than him. He had fought wars, literal ones, against enemies who had tried to destroy him. But the ones he faced now were far more insidious. These were the people who had erased him from their memory, the ones who denied him respect based purely on the color of his skin and the weakness they perceived in his disabled body. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, a sensation that was all too familiar, the quiet rage that simmered just beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. John had been an observer for so long, watching others win battles, make deals, and take what they wanted without ever being questioned. But no more. He had earned his place, and if these people thought they could treat him like a beggar, they were gravely mistaken. "I'm not going anywhere," John said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "You will let me in." The guard's lip curled into a sneer, as if the words coming out of John's mouth were nothing more than an amusing inconvenience. His hand, still clutching the radio, hovered over the button to summon more help. The dismissiveness was palpable. It wasn't just that they saw him as an outsider, it was that they saw him as less than human. To them, John was nothing more than a statistic, a casualty of a system that had no room for people like him. "You don't belong here," the guard said coldly, his eyes scanning John's frame, noting the crutches, the worn clothes, the way he carried himself. The man's disgust was obvious, and in that moment John knew. His race and his disability were enough for the guard to decide that he didn't deserve to be in this space. John's grip on the crutches tightened, and he took a step forward, feeling the burn in his legs, the weight of every injury that had scarred his body. He could feel the stares of the other bank employees on him, the whispers behind their hands. He knew what they were thinking. Another black man, a crippled one, trying to climb the ladder that had never been meant for people like him. A man who had fought, bled, and survived, but who still wasn't welcome in the places that celebrated success. He had expected this. He had expected this treatment, this racism wrapped in a thin veil of politeness, the condescension, the hidden malice behind the smiles. It wasn't just the guard, it was the whole system. The entire institution was built on the idea that people like John, people of color, were meant to serve, not to be served. They were meant to stay in their place, to work the bottom rung of the ladder, to be invisible. But John wasn't invisible, not anymore. "I said I'm not leaving," he repeated, his voice steady, though the fury within him boiled over. He could feel it now, this overwhelming sensation of power rising within him, like a storm gathering on the horizon. He wasn't just fighting for a seat at this table. He was fighting for his dignity, for every single moment he had been denied in his life because of the color of his skin. For a split second, there was silence. The guard's eyes narrowed, his posture shifting slightly. He didn't know what to make of this situation. He didn't know how to handle a man who wasn't cowering, who wasn't begging for a chance. And that uncertainty was enough for John to take the next step. "I own this bank," John declared, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The words were met with a stunned pause, the weight of them lingering in the air. John watched as the guard's expression shifted from smug indifference to confusion, then suspicion. "What did you say?" The guard's tone shifted, now laced with disbelief. "I said," John repeated, each word enunciated clearly, "I own a significant amount of shares in this bank. I am one of your largest shareholders." The guard's face flushed slightly, his hand tightening on the radio as he turned toward the entrance, clearly considering whether he should call for more backup. But John could see the flicker of doubt in the guard's eyes, the uncertainty in his stance. There was a moment of hesitation. The guard was trying to process the information, trying to figure out if this was some sort of trick or some strange joke. But John knew. He knew exactly what was going through the man's mind. He had seen it before, the disbelief, the inability to comprehend that someone like him could hold power, could possess something of value. People like John weren't supposed to own things. People like John weren't supposed to be in positions of power. "You're a shareholder," the guard sneered, his voice dripping with disbelief, almost as if he was mocking John. "A man like you? Don't make me laugh. You think you can waltz in here just because you own a couple of stocks?" John's eyes hardened, the raw fury in his chest rising to the surface like a tidal wave. No more playing by their rules, no more silence, no more looking the other way. "I'm not just any man," John said, his voice low and dangerous. I'm not some charity case. I didn't get here by begging. I fought for this. I earned this. You—" He pointed at the guard, his finger trembling with anger but resolute in its motion. "You don't get to look at me like I'm nothing. You don't get to treat me like I don't belong." The guard's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. It was clear that John's words had struck a nerve, rattling the carefully constructed armor the man wore. As the tension between them thickened, John noticed something else. The employees in the lobby, who had been watching the scene unfold, began to murmur among themselves. The whispers grew louder, more pronounced, and John could feel their eyes on him, their judgment. It wasn't just the guard who saw him as a threat, it was everyone. There was a sharp, almost imperceptible shift in the air. The bank was a fortress of glass and stone, but it had no power over the fire in John's chest. The next moment was a blur. The guard spoke into his radio again, his words a sharp command for backup. But before anyone could respond, the doors of the bank flew open and 2 more guards appeared. Their uniforms were crisply pressed, their faces cold and impassive. They looked at John, sizing him up with disdain. "Sir, you need to leave," one of them said, his tone flat, as though he had delivered this message 1,000 times before to people who were used to being told no. John's lip curled slightly. He had been here before. He had been on the other side of the door, the one who was told to leave, the one who wasn't good enough, the one who wasn't worthy of respect. But now the tables had turned. "I don't think you understand," John said, his voice growing colder with each syllable. "I'm not the one who's leaving here." And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the situation exploded. The guards rushed toward him, their hands reaching for his crutches, grabbing his arms, trying to force him to move. But John, fueled by the raw anger that had built up over years of oppression, of being told he didn't matter, wasn't going down without a fight. He shoved one of the guards away with surprising strength, his crutches slamming into the marble floor with a force that reverberated through the lobby. The others faltered for a moment, but the moment of hesitation was all John needed. He pushed forward again, his heart racing, his mind consumed with the need to make them understand. This was more than just a physical altercation. This was a battle for his dignity, a battle to prove that he was no longer invisible, no longer the man who had been tossed aside. He had a right to be here, and he wasn't going anywhere. As the guards closed in on him again, he braced himself. The noise in the bank swelled, shouts, the clatter of footsteps, the tension in the air almost suffocating. But John stood firm. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. John's heart pounded as the 2 security guards closed in on him. Their faces, emotionless masks of authority, betrayed the underlying disgust they held for him. They didn't just want to remove him from the premises. They wanted to break him, to force him to feel the weight of his worthlessness, to remind him that no matter how much money he had, no matter how many shares he owned, in their eyes, he was still just a black man on crutches. The pain from his old wounds flared up as he shifted his weight. The crutches, which had once been a tool to help him regain some semblance of independence, were now an obstacle to his escape. But in this moment, they were also his weapons. He wasn't going to let them drag him out of this bank like a criminal. He wasn't going to be the object of their shameful display of power. "Step away, sir," one of the guards growled, his voice harsh. The arrogance in his tone was unmistakable. John had seen this before. He'd seen it in the eyes of every racist who had ever crossed his path. People who believed they were untouchable. People who believed that a man like him didn't deserve to exist in their world, much less challenge their authority. But John wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. He leaned heavily on his crutches, the pressure in his arms and shoulders like a constant reminder of the pain he lived with every day. But he didn't care. He was no longer the wounded soldier who had returned home to a world that had no place for him. He was something else now. Something stronger. He had made it here, against all odds, and he wasn't going to let anyone forget it. "I don't think you understand," John said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not here as some beggar looking for a handout. I'm here because I own this place. I belong here." The second guard stepped forward, his gaze hardening as he sized John up. He was taller than the first one, with an air of superiority that only grew more pronounced the longer he stood there. His eyes drifted over John, scanning him from head to toe with a look that was meant to humiliate him. It was the kind of look that said, "I know exactly what you are. and you don't belong here." The guard's lip curled into a sneer and his voice took on a mocking tone. "Own this place. You, look at you. You can barely stand, let alone do anything useful here. You're a nobody, a washed-up, crippled has-been who thinks he's entitled to the world. Get out of my sight before I make you leave." The words stung, but John didn't flinch. He had been called worse, much worse, throughout his life. He had grown thick skin over the years, a barrier against the hatred and racism that had been hurled at him from all directions. But this was different. The guard's words weren't just a simple insult. They were a calculated attempt to strip him of his humanity, to reduce him to nothing more than a statistic, a broken man who no longer had a place in the world. But John was no longer the man he once was. He had fought through too much to let someone like this drag him down. His jaw tightened, his hands gripping the crutches with a strength that surprised even him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said through clenched teeth. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying fury in it now. "You don't get to decide that. I've earned my place here, and if you think you can bully me into submission, you're dead wrong." The guards exchanged a glance, their silent communication more telling than anything they could say aloud. They were growing more agitated by the second. They had expected John to back down. They had expected him to cower, to apologize for his presence, to beg for mercy. But instead, he stood there, unyielding, a man who refused to be broken. The second guard stepped even closer, his face now just inches from John's. John could feel the heat of the man's breath, the oppressive weight of his disdain. "You think you're special, don't you?" the guard sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You think just because you own a couple of shares, that means you're one of us? You're nothing more than a charity case, a token. They let you buy in just to make themselves look good. But you'll never be part of our world. You'll never be on the same level as us." John's breath caught in his throat, but he refused to let the man see how deeply his words had cut. He had heard this before, not just from people like the guard, but from people he had once called his friends. He had heard it from the world that had shoved him aside, from the world that had always told him he wasn't good enough. But John knew better now. He knew that these words, these insults, were nothing but lies. "No," John said, his voice steady, his grip on his crutches tightening. "I'm not like you. I'm not a man who hides behind his privilege and his money. I've fought for every damn thing I have. I've bled for it, and I've paid a price you'll never understand." The guard took a step back, clearly unnerved by John's unwavering defiance. But the damage had been done. John could see the contempt in the man's eyes, the same contempt that had been etched into the faces of so many people who had crossed his path over the years. "You're just a token," the guard muttered again, as if repeating the insult would make it true. "You're a joke. You don't belong here. You're just a reminder of what happens when the system lets anyone in." But John wasn't listening anymore. The words had lost their sting. He could see the hatred, the frustration in the guard's face, and he knew it had nothing to do with him. It had to do with everything this man had ever believed about himself and the world he inhabited. The guard wasn't angry at John for being there. He was angry because John's very presence in this space that was meant for people like him, like the guards, was a direct challenge to everything he thought he knew. John's hands trembled, but not with fear. He was done with fear. He was done with hiding behind his wounds, behind his crutches. If they thought they could make him feel small, they were mistaken. If they thought they could make him feel insignificant, they were wrong. "I've fought my whole life to get to this point," John said, his voice rising as his confidence began to fill the space between them. "I didn't get here because someone took pity on me. I didn't get here because of some charity program. I got here because I'm smarter, stronger, and more determined than you'll ever be. And I will be damned if I let anyone, especially someone like you, tell me that I don't belong." The guards hesitated. John's words hung in the air, a challenge they weren't sure how to respond to. For the first time since the altercation had begun, they seemed unsure of themselves. They had expected him to break down, to retreat, to leave like all the others. But John wasn't like all the others. He wasn't going anywhere. "You'll regret this," the first guard said, his voice dripping with venom. "This is your last warning. Leave now, or we'll have to call the police." John didn't flinch. "Go ahead, call the police. But you better make sure they're ready to arrest a man who's been fighting for his rights his whole life. And when you do, I want you to tell them that I'm not going anywhere. I've earned my place here. I don't need your permission." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. It was as if everyone in the lobby was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The guards looked at each other, uncertain. But John didn't care. He was done playing their game. This was his moment. He had stood up for himself before, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who had been told they didn't belong, who had been beaten down and cast aside, simply because they weren't what the world wanted them to be. "I'm staying," John said one final time, his voice steady and resolute. The guards stood motionless, torn between their duty and the realization that John was not backing down. And in that moment, the world began to shift. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our story from? Has anything like this happened to you before? Feel free to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the journey so far, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now let's continue. The standoff in the lobby continued to stretch in unbearable silence. The weight of John's defiance seemed to hang in the air, thick and unrelenting, like a storm cloud that had yet to release its fury. The guards stood before him, now wary, almost confused by the sheer audacity of a man who refused to cower. His crutches, once a symbol of his injury, now appeared to be extensions of his willpower, tools of resistance, of power, of survival. John could feel the eyes of the onlookers pressing into him, invisible but as real as the air he breathed. The employees in the bank were no strangers to conflict, but they had never seen someone like John stand up to the institution this way. They were used to the polished, sanitized version of corporate life, where everyone knew their place. The wealthy, the powerful, and the people who served them. Everyone was expected to adhere to the rules, to follow the unwritten codes of decorum that kept the world in its comfortable, predictable place. And John, with his worn-out clothes, his black skin, and his crutches, was the antithesis of that order. His very presence was a challenge. The second guard, who had been eyeing John with disdain, shifted uncomfortably. He was used to exerting control, to making people bend to his will. He had done it countless times, but there was something about John's unwavering stare, the fire in his eyes, that unsettled him. He had seen men like John before, men who had been crushed by the system, who had been ground down until they were nothing more than shadows of their former selves. But John wasn't like that. He wasn't broken, and the guard didn't know how to handle that. "Do you think you're better than me?" the second guard asked, his voice sharp, almost accusing. There was a trace of fear hidden beneath the bravado, a crack in his confidence that John had exposed with a few carefully chosen words. "You think just because you have some shares, you can walk in here and demand respect. You think you can command attention just because you managed to scrape together a few pennies." John's eyes locked with his. He could feel the sting of racism behind the words, the judgment, the centuries of prejudice woven into each syllable. It wasn't just the guard's words that cut deep. It was the way he said them. The way he presumed John didn't belong, simply because of his skin color and his physical condition. It was as if no amount of success could ever erase the color of his skin in their eyes. No matter what John achieved, he would always be less than them. Always. "You don't get to define me," John said, his voice cold and controlled, though his anger simmered just below the surface. "You don't get to decide who I am, what I'm worth. I've fought for every inch of ground I stand on, and I'm not going to let someone like you tell me I don't belong." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. John wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for every person who had been told they didn't belong, for every person who had been silenced and ignored, for every black man, woman, and child who had been forced to endure the indignities of a system that treated them as less than human. His battle wasn't just against these two men in front of him. It was against the entire system that had kept people like him in the shadows for so long. The second guard's face turned red, the veins on his neck bulging as he took a step forward, his fist clenched. John could see the rage building in him, the frustration of someone who had been so used to being in control, so used to wielding his authority without question, now faced with a man who refused to bend. It was the kind of rage that had been passed down through generations, the kind of rage that was fueled by fear and insecurity, the kind of rage that came from the belief that someone like John was never supposed to be his equal. But John wasn't afraid. He wasn't backing down. "You don't belong here," the guard spat, his voice barely contained now. You're a charity case, nothing more. You think your money makes you something special. You think we care. We don't care. You're a black man with a crutch, trying to play in a game you'll never win. You'll never be one of us." John's jaw tightened, his hands trembling with barely contained fury. But he refused to let the guards see him flinch. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. "You don't get it, do you?" John said, his voice a low growl. "I don't need to be one of you. I'm already something more than you could ever be. I'm a man who's fought for everything I have. I'm a man who's walked through hell and come out the other side. And I'm not done yet. You can look at me all you want. You can throw your insults at me. But I'm not leaving. I'm not going anywhere." The guard hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to respond. His anger was still there, burning hot, but there was something else too, something John could feel in the air. It was the unmistakable sound of doubt creeping in. The guard had always believed that power and privilege could control everything, that they could break anyone who stood in their way. But now, faced with a man who refused to bow to that power, who refused to be intimidated, he wasn't so sure anymore. Before the tension could escalate any further, the first guard stepped in. His posture was stiff, his gaze calculating. "Enough," he said, his voice hard. "We're not going to stand here and argue with you. You've made your point, but we've got our orders. You need to leave." John didn't budge. He stood there, looking the guard in the eye, refusing to let them see him as weak, as someone who could be dismissed and forgotten. His heart was pounding, his body screaming for release, but he held steady. He was done being silent. He was done being ignored. "Call the police then," John said, his voice calm but unwavering. "Call whoever you want, but you better be ready to explain why you're trying to force out one of your largest shareholders. Because I'm not going anywhere." The first guard scowled, clearly frustrated, but he didn't make a move. The air was thick with tension as the realization began to settle in. John wasn't going to leave, and neither was he backing down. "I'm not a charity case," John repeated, this time louder, more forceful. "I'm not your token. I'm not some nice gesture to make you feel better about yourselves. You want to keep treating me like I don't belong here? Fine, but remember, I'm a part of this now. I'm not the one you're going to push around. Not anymore." The words stung more than anything. The guards had believed for so long that they could keep people like John in their place, that they could use their position of power to keep the world in order. But what they didn't understand was that John wasn't some scared veteran begging for sympathy. He wasn't some black man who had been kept down by a system that didn't care. He was someone who had fought for everything he had, and now he was fighting for his right to be treated as an equal. For a moment, the guards stood in silence. They didn't know what to do next, and that, more than anything, spoke volumes. John took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. He was ready for whatever came next, whether it was the police, more security, or 100 more insults thrown his way. He was ready, because he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every person who had been humiliated, belittled, and forgotten. And no matter what, he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The silence was broken when the first guard turned sharply and motioned for the other to follow him. The tension remained, but they seemed to sense that the battle was no longer theirs to fight. The walls, which had once felt like a fortress, now seemed like they were beginning to crack. And for the first time in a long while, John felt something shift within him. This was only the beginning. The sound of John's crutches against the polished marble echoed in the now quiet lobby. The guards had retreated, but the silence that followed felt like the calm before a storm. The other employees, those who had witnessed the scene unfold, were still, their eyes locked on John, as if they weren't sure what they had just seen. There had been no grand confrontation, no violent outbursts. Instead, it had been a quiet defiance, a refusal to submit to the weight of racism, to the crushing weight of a system that had no place for someone like John. And it had shaken them. It had shaken them all. John adjusted his crutches and surveyed the lobby one last time. His chest was still tight, his heartbeat thumping in his ears. But now, for the first time in years, he felt something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Not the kind that came from wealth or influence, but the kind that came from standing firm in the face of everything that had ever tried to tear him down. He wasn't just a man on crutches anymore. He wasn't just a broken veteran, cast aside by a world that had no use for him. He was a man who had reclaimed his dignity, a man who had refused to be silenced. As he turned to leave, he noticed a few heads turning away from him, their eyes filled with discomfort. It was clear now that the encounter had made them uneasy. Some of them, those who had once looked down on him, were now faced with the reality of what it meant to treat someone like him as less than human. The realization was bitter, but it was also the truth. But before he could step outside, he was stopped by the voice of one of the employees, a woman who had been quietly watching the scene unfold from behind a desk. She was older, well-dressed, and had a sharp, calculating look in her eyes. Her name tag read Margaret, and she was one of the bank's senior managers. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice clipped, almost hesitant. John stopped in his tracks, his hand gripping the crutches tightly as he turned toward her. He had expected more condescension, more pity, maybe even another round of insults, but instead, there was something else in her gaze, something that was harder to read. She wasn't looking at him with the contempt he had grown so used to. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice guarded. He wasn't sure what to make of this. Was she about to try to smooth things over with an empty apology? Or was she here to dismiss him once more, to tell him that he was never meant to be part of this world? "I saw what happened back there," she said, her tone slightly softer now. "And I just wanted to say that, well, I've never seen anyone stand up to them like that. You're not supposed to be here, you know. They're right about that." John's heart skipped a beat at her words, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What are you trying to say?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering around the room as though to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Look, I'm not here to get into all of that with you," she said. "But you're right about one thing. You don't belong here. You'll never be one of us. But I think you already know that." John's stomach twisted. He'd known people like her all his life. People who wrapped their racism in a veneer of politeness. People who smiled to your face, but took every opportunity to remind you that you would never be allowed into their world. Margaret wasn't different. She wasn't offering him a chance for change. She was just confirming that he would always be an outsider. She continued, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "The thing is, there are people higher up, people who would love to see someone like you out of the picture. People who think you're a problem. You think your shares matter. To them, it's just a token, something to show that they're diverse. You're the token shareholder, and the moment you stop playing along, you won't be needed anymore." John's mind raced, the realization settling in with a cold weight. He had thought that his shares, his power, would be enough to protect him. He had thought that by claiming a piece of the institution, by forcing them to see him as an equal, he could escape the oppressive system that had denied him at every turn. But Margaret's words were a slap in the face. He had been naive. The system wasn't just indifferent to his struggles, it was actively working against him. His wealth, his position, none of it meant anything to the people who ran this bank, the people who controlled the strings behind the curtains. "You're telling me they'll just get rid of me," John said, his voice tight with anger. "That no matter what I do, no matter how much I own, I'll never be more than a token to them." Margaret nodded, her eyes briefly flickering with something like pity before she quickly masked it. "That's the way it works, John. It always has. And they'll make sure you know that. They'll find a way to push you out, to erase you, just like they've done with everyone who's come before you." The weight of her words hit him like a blow to the chest. He had known that the battle for his place in this world wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected it to be this ruthless. He had thought that by getting in, by earning his place at the table, he could change things. But Margaret's admission shattered that illusion. The realization burned, but it didn't break him. "I'm not going anywhere," John said, his voice cold with resolve. "You're wrong about one thing. I don't need to be one of you. I don't need your approval, and I don't need your pity. But I'm not leaving this place. I've earned my seat at this table, and if you or anyone else thinks they can take that away from me, they're going to have a fight on their hands." Margaret watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "I admire your courage, John, but just remember, you're playing with fire now. You think this is just about a bank, about shares, about money. It's not. This is about power, and they'll burn you alive to keep it." John didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what she meant. The power wasn't in the shares, in the money, or in the illusion of influence. The power was in the ability to control the narrative, to control who got to exist in these spaces, who got to be seen, and who was relegated to the sidelines. John's gaze hardened, and he slowly turned away from Margaret, his crutches tapping lightly on the marble floor as he moved toward the door. The lobby was quiet now, the atmosphere thick with the weight of what had just transpired. He didn't know what was coming next, but he wasn't afraid. He had come too far to be afraid now. He pushed open the door and stepped into the cold, biting air of the outside world. The city stretched out before him, indifferent, vast, and unyielding. But in that moment, John didn't feel small. He didn't feel invisible. He felt alive. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cold wind bit through John's jacket as he walked away from the bank. His crutches clicked on the pavement, the rhythm a steady reminder of the battle he had just fought and the one he still had ahead. The world felt different now, heavier, as though it was closing in on him with each step he took. The words Margaret had spoken echoed in his mind. You're the token shareholder. They'll find a way to push you out. You'll never be one of them. But John wasn't going to let those words define him. He couldn't. He had come too far, had fought too hard to be reduced to the role of an outsider. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity. It was about standing tall when the world wanted to break you down, about forcing them to see you when they would rather pretend you didn't exist. Still, as he walked through the city streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He had made an enemy of the system, of the very institution that had been built to keep people like him down, and now they would stop at nothing to destroy him. They had the power, they had the resources, they had the means to make his life a living hell, and they had already begun. He stopped at a corner, leaning heavily on his crutches. He knew he had to be careful now. Every step he took, every word he said, would be scrutinized. There was no going back. The moment he had challenged the bank's authority, he had signed his own fate. He had no idea what they would do next, but he knew they wouldn't just let him walk away unscathed. Not after what he had done. As John stood there, a black sedan pulled up beside him, its tinted windows reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights. The car slowed to a stop, and the window rolled down. Inside, a man in a dark suit looked at him with a cold, calculating gaze. His eyes were sharp, predatory, like a wolf sizing up its prey. "You've made a mess of things, haven't you?" the man said, his voice low and deliberate. John didn't flinch. He had been expecting something like this. The people who ran the bank, the ones who held all the cards, had their own way of dealing with problems. And problems like him, black, disabled, and defiant, were problems they didn't take lightly. "I'm not going anywhere," John replied, his voice steady. "You can't intimidate me." The man in the car smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was the smile of someone who had long ago mastered the art of cruelty, of controlling people by making them feel small, insignificant. "You misunderstand," the man said, his tone almost condescending. "This isn't about intimidation. It's about control. You think you've won? You think your little protest means anything? You're just a pawn, John. And you'll learn soon enough that you don't get to make moves on this board without consequences." John's grip on his crutches tightened. He had heard this before. People who tried to break him. People who thought they could use fear to crush him. But John wasn't afraid anymore. Not of them. Not of their power. Not of their threats. "You're wrong," John said, taking a step closer to the car. "I'm not a pawn. I'm not your token. And I'm not going to back down. Whatever you think you can do to me, it won't work. I'll keep fighting." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold indifference. "You'll fight. I'm sure you will. But it won't change anything. You'll soon learn that you don't belong in this world. You're just another example of how the system bends over backward to include people like you. You're not a part of the game, John. You're just a token. And soon you'll realize what happens to people like you when they start to believe they have a seat at the table." The man's words hung in the air, heavy with malice. He wasn't just talking about John's place at the bank. He was talking about John's place in society. In their world. The world where people like him, black, poor, disabled, were always meant to stay in the shadows, always meant to be less than. But John wasn't listening to him anymore. He was past that. The words the man had spoken were just another attempt to push him down, another attempt to make him feel small. John had heard it all before. He had heard the insults, the slurs, the dismissive comments. He had heard the whispers of people who thought they knew his place in the world, and he was done with it. "I don't need your world," John said, his voice fierce, unwavering. "I fought for my place, and I'll keep fighting. You can threaten me all you want, but it's not going to make me go away." The man in the car stared at him for a moment, as if weighing his words. Then, without another word, he rolled the window up and motioned for the driver to pull away. The car sped off into the night, leaving John standing alone on the street corner. John stood there for a long time, his breath steady, his mind racing. He knew the fight was far from over. If anything, it had only just begun. The people at the bank, the ones who had tried to push him aside, weren't going to let him walk away unscathed. They had the power, they had the influence, they had the money, and they would stop at nothing to make sure he knew his place. But that didn't matter to John. He had fought for his right to be seen, to be heard, and he wasn't going to stop now. The next day, John was back at the bank. This time, he didn't wait in the lobby. He didn't even bother with the front doors. He knew they would be waiting for him there, ready to stop him, ready to call security the moment they saw him. Instead, he walked around the back, past the loading docks, past the steel gates that separated the world of the rich and powerful from the world of the rest. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what he had imagined when he bought his shares in the bank, when he had thought that by becoming a part of the institution, he could change things from the inside. But this was the reality now. The only way to fight back was to take the battle to their door. He slipped through the shadows, unnoticed by the few employees who were working late, and made his way to the back entrance. His crutches tapped quietly against the concrete, a stark contrast to the heavy footsteps of the guards who would soon come after him. Inside, the hallways were cold, sterile, like a prison. The walls were lined with expensive art, each piece a reminder of the money that flowed through this place, a reminder of the people who ran it and the power they held. But John wasn't intimidated. He wasn't afraid anymore. He had come here for one thing: answers, and he wasn't leaving until he had them. John pushed open the door to the boardroom, his crutches tapping against the polished floor. The room was empty, save for the long table that stretched across the center, the leather chairs that were meant for men and women far more powerful than him. But John wasn't here to play by their rules. He wasn't here to ask for permission. The sound of his crutches hitting the floor echoed through the empty room, a loud reminder that he was no longer the invisible man in the background. He had come here to take his seat at the table, whether they liked it or not. As he stood there, the cold light from the overhead lamps casting long shadows on the walls, John realized something. He was never going to be part of their world. He was never going to be accepted into their circles. But that didn't matter, because John had something they could never take away from him. He had his dignity, and he had his voice, and as long as he had those, he would never be silenced. John stood in the cold, silent boardroom, his crutches tapping softly against the floor as he surveyed the empty space. It felt like the walls were closing in on him. This cold, sterile room was a far cry from the place he had imagined when he first bought his shares in the bank. He had thought that by gaining ownership, he would finally earn the respect he deserved, that the system would have no choice but to acknowledge him, to see him as an equal. But now, standing here in the darkened room, he knew the truth. He was never going to be their equal. He was just a reminder to them that the system they had built was imperfect, that it wasn't only for the people they deemed worthy. He could see it in their eyes, the disdain, the casual disregard, the way they looked through him as though he didn't belong. But what if he didn't belong? What if he wasn't supposed to be here? John clenched his fists, the anger rising within him like a slow burn. He wasn't going to back down. He had come too far to turn around now. He had earned his place, even if they refused to recognize it. No, this was more than just a fight for recognition. This was about taking control of his life, about standing tall in a world that had constantly tried to keep him down. He had been humiliated, trampled on, and forced to accept his position for far too long. He wasn't going to let them do it anymore, not this time. The heavy footsteps of approaching guards shattered the silence, the sound echoing through the halls like thunder. John's heart raced, his pulse quickening with the knowledge that his time was running out. He had already crossed a line, and he knew they weren't going to just let him waltz out of here unscathed. The guards rounded the corner, their faces impassive, their uniforms pressed and pristine. They saw John standing there, his crutches tapping softly against the floor, and for a moment they paused. They didn't speak. They just watched him, sizing him up, probably wondering what to do with a man who refused to be intimidated. John's jaw tightened as the guards closed in on him, their steps deliberate, calculated. They had been sent here for one reason: to remove him, to send a message that people like him had no place in their world, that no amount of money or power could change that. One of the guards stepped forward, his hand resting on the baton at his side. His eyes were cold, calculating. "You need to leave," the guard said, his voice a low growl, the words laced with barely contained contempt. "Now!" John's eyes never left the guard's face. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him flinch, seeing him bend. He wasn't some broken man anymore. He had fought for his place, and he was not going to let them take it away from him. "No," John replied, his voice steady and unyielding. "I'm not going anywhere." The guard took a step closer, his hand still resting on his baton, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. His expression remained unreadable, but John could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The guard's words were designed to humiliate, to remind him that no matter how much he owned, no matter how much power he thought he had, he would always be less than them. "You don't belong here," the guard said, his voice dripping with venom. "You're just a token. You don't have the right to be here. The only reason you're even in this building is because we allowed it. But now you've overstayed your welcome." John's teeth clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the crutches harder. The words stung, but they didn't break him. He had heard this before. He had been told that he didn't belong, that he wasn't good enough. From the time he was a child, the world had made it clear that he was never meant to be a part of their system. But this time, it wasn't going to work. He wasn't going to let them push him around anymore. "Who are you to decide where I belong?" John asked, his voice calm but laced with fury. "I'm not a charity case. I'm not a token. I'm a shareholder. I have just as much right to be here as any one of you, so don't tell me where I belong." The guard's face twisted in disdain, and for a moment John thought he might strike him, might make some show of power to put him in his place. But instead, the guard stepped back, his expression hardening. "You think you have rights," the guard sneered. "You think you're entitled to anything here. You're nothing. You're a joke, and we'll make sure everyone knows it." John didn't flinch. He had heard these words before too. He had been called a joke, a failure, a worthless man who would never amount to anything. He had been told that his dreams were just that, dreams. But now, standing here, he knew better. He knew that this was just another attempt to break him, to remind him of his place in a world that had never truly accepted him. "Well, I guess I'm going to have to prove you wrong," John said, his voice low and determined. The guard's eyes narrowed, and he nodded to his partner, signaling for him to move in. They were going to drag him out, force him to leave like a criminal. But John wasn't going to make it easy for them. "You're going to regret this," the first guard said, his voice cold, his words a thinly veiled threat. "You can't fight the system. The sooner you realize that, the better." John didn't respond. He didn't need to. He was done trying to explain himself to people who would never understand. The guard's words meant nothing to him anymore. He had lived through enough pain, enough struggle, to know that none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was standing his ground. The only thing that mattered was refusing to be broken. As the guards closed in on him, John gritted his teeth and swung his crutches toward the first guard's chest, knocking him back a few paces. The second guard lunged toward him, but John twisted, using the crutches as leverage to push himself back. His body screamed in protest as he moved, his injuries flaring up, but the fire inside him pushed him forward. He wasn't going to let them touch him. He wasn't going to let them humiliate him. "Stay back!" John shouted, his voice sharp and filled with an anger that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I'm not your victim. I'm not your pawn. I'm not going anywhere." The guards hesitated for a moment, their hands still hovering near their belts, but the hesitation was all John needed. He backed up, positioning himself between the guards and the door, ready to make a move if he had to. His heart was pounding in his chest, his muscles aching, but he wasn't afraid. He wasn't going to let them take him down. But before anything else could happen, the door to the boardroom opened. John froze, his gaze snapping to the entrance. The woman who entered was not like the others. She wasn't a guard. She wasn't one of the employees. She was dressed in a tailored suit, her posture commanding, her eyes sharp and calculating. It was Margaret, the senior manager from the day before. "Enough!" she said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. The guards stopped in their tracks, eyes flickering toward Margaret as she stepped further into the room, her gaze never leaving John's face. There was no sign of hostility in her eyes, just something cold, distant. But there was also something else, something like understanding. "Margaret, what is this?" the first guard asked, confusion evident in his voice. "This man is—" "I know who he is," Margaret interrupted, her tone firm. "And I know what you're trying to do, but this isn't your decision. He's one of us now. And whether you like it or not, he's here to stay." John felt the weight of her words sink in. For the first time, it seemed like someone in this building understood. She wasn't offering him pity. She wasn't offering him sympathy. She was simply acknowledging that in this moment, he had as much right to be here as anyone else. The guards exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure of how to respond. But in that moment, John knew one thing for certain. This fight wasn't over. It wasn't even close. But for the first time in a long while, John felt like he might just have a chance. The tension in the boardroom was palpable. John stood there, his crutches in hand, facing Margaret. The guards, who had once towered over him in sheer physical intimidation, now seemed to shrink in her presence, their expressions a mixture of confusion and reluctance. For a fleeting moment, John allowed himself to believe that he might finally be heard, that his place in this world might no longer be denied. But as the silence stretched on, his thoughts began to cloud with uncertainty. Was this a moment of true victory, or was Margaret just another player in a game that had been rigged from the start? Margaret's gaze was steady, though her posture suggested a subtle tension, as if she too were awaiting something. She hadn't come here to apologize, John could tell that much. And despite her words, her clear acknowledgement that John had earned his right to be in this building, there was still something about the way she carried herself, something that made him uneasy. The guards looked at each other, waiting for an order, unsure whether to challenge her or to obey. Margaret's voice broke the silence again, this time colder, more commanding. "Get out," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she addressed the two guards. "I'll handle this." The guards hesitated for a moment, then, without another word, they turned and left the room, their footsteps echoing down the hall. For a moment it felt as though the room had been emptied of its tension, but John could still feel the weight of everything hanging in the air. Margaret turned toward him, her expression hardening as she regarded him. "You really think you've won, don't you?" she asked, her tone far less conciliatory now. There was a hint of something darker in her voice, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "You think because I told them to leave, that means you're in charge now, that you've somehow won this fight, but you're wrong. I didn't come in here to help you, John. I came in here to make sure you don't make things worse for yourself." John stiffened. For a moment he didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what to make of her words. He had expected some level of disdain, but this felt like something more. It felt like a warning. "You're still a token to them," she continued, her voice low but laced with venom. "That's all you'll ever be, no matter how many shares you own, no matter how many crutches you throw in their faces. You'll never be one of them. You'll never be one of us." The words hit John like a slap, but he didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on hers, refusing to let her see the hurt those words caused. He had heard them before, over and over again, but hearing them from her, someone who had seemed to offer a semblance of understanding, was different. "You don't know anything about me," John said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of fury. "I'm not some puppet you can control. I'm not some black man they let in here as a token to make themselves feel good. I earned my place here. I fought for it, and I won't be silenced." Margaret's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes now, a flicker of something like regret, like she realized too late that she had underestimated him. "That's exactly what they want you to think," Margaret said, her tone still sharp, but now tinged with something more vulnerable. "You think you're in control of this. You think because you've challenged them that they'll respect you. The moment you took that seat at the table, you signed your own fate. You're just a symbol, John, a convenient one. They'll let you sit there for a while, let you think you're part of the club, but in the end, you'll be just like every other token they've used to hide their own guilt. And when they're done with you, they'll throw you away. John's heart sank, but his resolve didn't waver. He wasn't going to be discarded like the others. He wasn't going to let them define him, not this time, not anymore. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "If they want me gone, they'll have to do it themselves." Margaret let out a small laugh, but it was bitter, laced with something like pity. "You really think they'll do that? You think they'll have to get their hands dirty to get rid of you? No, John, it won't come to that. They'll just make your life miserable. They'll make sure you never feel like you belong here, like you're always on the outside looking in. They'll use every ounce of power they have to break you down until you're begging to leave." For a moment, the words hit John like a punch to the gut. The weight of what she was saying settled over him, and the fight in his chest began to feel like it was slipping away. He had known the battle would be hard, but he hadn't realized just how far they were willing to go to keep people like him in their place. It wasn't just about the bank anymore. It was about a system that had always worked to suppress those who didn't fit the mold. And John had foolishly believed that his presence here could change that. But Margaret's words rang true. She wasn't wrong. They would break him, slowly, insidiously, in ways he couldn't even predict. He had seen it happen to so many others, people who had tried to rise above their station, only to be crushed under the weight of the system they had dared to challenge. They would make him feel like he didn't belong. They would make him doubt himself, doubt everything he had fought for. And there was nothing he could do about it. Not if he wanted to keep his position, his shares. Not if he wanted to survive in their world. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He was trapped. But then, something shifted inside him. A spark of defiance. A flicker of the man he had once been. The man who had fought in wars. Who had survived against all odds. The man who had never given up. Even when everything around him told him he wasn't enough. "You're wrong," John said, his voice firm, the words coming from a deeper place within him. "I'm not going to let them break me. Not now, not ever. If they want to play this game, fine. But I'm not going to play by their rules. I'll find my own way." Margaret's eyes flickered with something almost like admiration, but it quickly disappeared, replaced with something colder. "Good luck with that," she said, her voice now almost detached. "But remember this, John. You're fighting against a system that's been in place for centuries, and the only thing that's going to happen is that they'll destroy you. Slowly, piece by piece." "I'll take my chances," John replied, his voice resolute. "I've already survived worse than this." Margaret didn't respond, but her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, her gaze measuring, assessing. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving John standing alone in the cold, sterile silence of the boardroom. As the door clicked shut behind her, John's crutches tapped softly against the floor. His mind raced, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just learned. He had known this fight wouldn't be easy, but now he understood just how far they were willing to go to break him. They would stop at nothing, but he wasn't going to let them win. He had already come too far. He had already sacrificed too much. He was in this fight for the long haul. The walls might be closing in, but John had never been one to back down from a fight. And this time, he wasn't going to let the system crush him. He would make them see him. He would make them acknowledge him, not as a token, but as a man. A man who had earned his place and who wasn't about to lose it. John didn't know how this battle would end, but he was ready. He had to be. The days that followed were a blur of cold silence and subtle threats. John had expected resistance, but the kind he encountered was far more insidious than he had imagined. It wasn't the loud, aggressive kind of hostility that one might encounter in an outright confrontation. It wasn't the kind that made itself obvious in the form of racist slurs or physical altercations. Instead, it was the quiet, deliberate exclusion, the kind of systemic disregard that seeped into every corner of the building, every conversation, every glance. John's phone buzzed with emails, each one more insistent than the last. His calls to various departments went unanswered, or if they were answered, it was with curt, dismissive responses. The more he tried to assert himself, the more the doors seemed to close. The deeper he pushed, the harder they pulled away. At first, he thought it was just a bad day. Maybe it was a series of miscommunications. But as time passed, the pattern became undeniable. It wasn't about incompetence or a lack of resources. It was deliberate. It was a quiet war of attrition, The very system he had fought to become a part of had turned against him. It was as though they had written him off. He wasn't the well-dressed, well-spoken success story they wanted to display to the world. He wasn't the polished, palatable version of success. He was a reminder of the cracks in their system, cracks they wanted to keep hidden. His presence was a challenge to the smooth, well-oiled machine they had built, and they were determined to get rid of him. John had expected some form of retaliation. What he hadn't prepared for was the quiet, unseen forces at play. They weren't going to kick him out of the building. No, that would have been too obvious. Instead, they were going to make him so invisible, so insignificant, that he would want to leave on his own. One morning, John walked into the lobby of the bank, his crutches tapping against the floor. As usual, he was met with a cold reception. The security guards nodded in his direction, their faces neutral, but it was the way they looked through him that hurt the most. He was invisible to them. No one acknowledged him. No one even looked his way. He made his way to the elevator, only to have the doors closed just as he approached. The elevator was empty, but it was as though someone had purposely hit the button to make sure it was on another floor when he arrived. He stood there for a moment, staring at the elevator doors, the sudden sting of rejection making his chest tighten. When he reached the boardroom, expecting to attend a meeting with the bank's senior executives, he found the door locked. A note had been placed on it, one that was both passive-aggressive and dismissive. Meeting cancelled, rescheduled without prior notice. John's hand hovered over the doorknob, the bitter taste of insult flooding his mouth. He had been deliberately excluded. His presence wasn't just unwanted, it was being actively erased. It wasn't just the physical barriers that they had put up, it was the subtle, unspoken ones. The ones that left him out of emails, the ones that made sure he didn't get invited to critical discussions, the ones that ensured he was always just a step behind, always struggling to catch up. They wanted him to know his place. He wasn't just a black man with crutches in their world. He was a symbol of everything they despised, everything they feared. John's mind raced as he sat in the empty boardroom, his crutches leaning against the table. He had thought that by purchasing shares, by positioning himself in a place of power, he could change things. He had been so naive. His mind wandered back to the earlier days, when he had believed that this was just a minor setback, that with time, he would earn his place. But now, as he looked around the cold, sterile room, he understood the true nature of the battle he was in. They were not going to give him a seat at the table. They weren't going to let him in. They were going to force him out, and they were going to do it quietly, insidiously, so that it would look like his own fault, so that no one could say they had done anything wrong. John's phone buzzed again, but he didn't need to check it to know who it was. Another email, another delay, another excuse for why he wasn't included. The world around him seemed to blur, and he felt the familiar pang of humiliation gnaw at his stomach. He had spent his life fighting to be seen, and now, even with his ownership, even with his voice, he was still invisible. But this time, something in John snapped. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't let them win. He had made it this far. He had fought too hard to just fade away, to let them erase him from their world. He wasn't going to be invisible anymore. He gathered his things and walked out of the boardroom, his crutches tapping loudly against the floor. The silence of the lobby greeted him, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what was happening. He had spent so much of his life trying to fit in, trying to belong, trying to prove that he was just as good as anyone else. But now, he realized, that wasn't enough. He had to prove that he was more than they thought he was. He had to show them that he wasn't going to let them define his worth. He made his way to the elevator again, but this time, he didn't wait for the doors to close. He pressed the button repeatedly, as if willing it to open faster. As he stood there, waiting, a thought occurred to him, a dangerous thought. What if he could flip the system on its head? What if, instead of fighting to be seen, he fought to expose the truth? What if he made them understand that their system was built on exclusion, on racism, on a kind of arrogance that kept people like him on the outside? What if he used the very thing they were trying to destroy him with, his ownership, his position, to dismantle their world from within? The elevator doors opened, and John stepped in, his heart pounding with the realization that this was no longer just about him. This was about something much bigger. It was about the people who had been told that they didn't belong, about every person who had been crushed by a system that had no room for them. It was about showing them that they couldn't keep pushing people down forever. Sooner or later, the weight would crush them, and he was going to be the one to make them feel it. As the elevator ascended, John's mind raced with ideas, with plans. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer going to let them erase him. He was going to take control, and he was going to make them see him. Not as a token, not as a symbol, but as someone who had earned his place in this world, and he wasn't going to back down. The doors opened, and John stepped out onto the executive floor, his crutches tapping loudly, echoing through the empty space. He wasn't sure how this fight would end. He wasn't even sure if he would make it through, but he knew one thing. He would not be ignored any longer. The game was on, and this time, it was his move. The walls may have been closing in, but John was ready to break through. John stood at the window, looking out over the city. The skyline shimmered under the dull glow of the evening sun, a cold reminder of the world that had always been just beyond his reach. The city pulsed with life, but in that moment, it felt distant, as if he was an observer, not a participant. It had been like this for days, weeks even. The weight of what he had been fighting for, what he had been enduring, had started to feel like it was too much to bear. But the truth was, he had no choice now. He couldn't turn back. The battle was no longer just about owning shares, about being seen, or even about proving he belonged. It was about something much more visceral, much more personal. It was about dignity. It was about standing tall in a world that had spent his whole life telling him to kneel, to be silent, to accept his place as lesser. They had underestimated him, and now they would see the cost of that mistake. John had made his move, and now there was no turning back. The phone on his desk buzzed, a sharp, intrusive sound that cut through the thick silence of the room. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. It was Margaret. She had been calling him for days now, trying to smooth things over, trying to make him understand that he was playing a game he couldn't win. Her voice, once tinged with a hint of support, now rang with desperation. But John had no interest in her explanations anymore. He had been silenced for too long. He had heard enough. He picked up the phone and answered with a sharp, "What do you want?" There was a pause on the other end before Margaret spoke, her tone tight with controlled frustration. "John, you need to stop this. You're going to destroy yourself if you keep going down this path. I tried to warn you. This isn't just a fight you can win. They're going to bury you. You're already a liability." John closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "They're going to bury you." The words felt like a poison, trying to seep into his resolve, trying to make him second-guess himself. But John wasn't going to let them break him. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing this for every person who has been silenced, every person who has been told they don't belong. I'm doing this because I'm sick of letting them tell me my worth. I'm sick of being invisible. You can't just walk away from that. Not now." Margaret was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, there was something different in her voice, something close to resignation. "I wish you could see it, John. I wish you could see how much they're going to destroy you. You think they'll listen to you? You think they'll respect you? You're nothing but a problem for them, a token they'll cast aside the moment you stop being useful. You're just another story for them to tell, just another black man who tried to take what wasn't his." John's grip tightened on the phone, his pulse quickening. Her words stung, but he wasn't going to let them land. He had fought for too long, endured too much, to let someone like Margaret convince him to give up now. "I'm not a story," he said, his voice hard. "I'm a person, and I'm not going anywhere." There was a long silence on the other end, and when Margaret spoke again, it was with the hollow, defeated tone of someone who had already made up her mind. "I tried to help you," she whispered, her voice small. "But this is the end. You're on your own now." John hung up the phone with a quiet click, the weight of her words lingering in the air. For a moment, he thought about what she had said. He had fought so hard to be seen, to claim a space in this world, but now it felt like it was all slipping away. The people who had once been in his corner, the ones who had seemed to understand, were now abandoning him. Margaret had been right about one thing. He was isolated. He was fighting an enemy that had the power, the money, the influence, and no intention of losing. But even as the walls seemed to close in, John knew one thing. He had already lost so much. He'd already been stripped of everything that mattered. His dignity, his pride, his identity. It had all been under attack long before he stepped into this fight. And now, he was too far in to back down. The door to his office opened with a quiet creak, and John turned, his heart pounding. In the doorway stood two men, tall, suited, their faces unreadable. They were part of the executive team, people who had once seen him as a potential ally, a useful pawn. But now, they were here to finish the job. They were here to send a message. One of the men, a balding man with a tight smile, stepped forward. "John," he said, his voice dripping with faux politeness, "I think you've made your point. It's time to leave." John's eyes narrowed as he stood up from the desk. His crutches shifted beneath him, the weight of his body pressing down. But he didn't care. He wasn't going to let them make him feel small. Not now. Not ever. "I'm not going anywhere," John said, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel. "You don't get to decide when I leave. I've earned my place here. You may not like it, but I'm not just going to disappear because you tell me to." The balding man chuckled, a hollow, mirthless sound. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said, his smile widening. "You're not some kind of hero. You're just a broken man trying to hold onto a seat at a table that wasn't made for you. You're a problem, John, and problems get dealt with. You don't belong here. You never did." John's heart thudded in his chest. The words cut deep, but they were nothing new. He had heard them all his life, but this time, they didn't break him. They only fueled the fire that had been burning inside him. "I belong here just as much as anyone else," John replied, his voice rising, echoing through the empty office. "You don't get to define me. You don't get to decide my worth. I'm here to stay." For a moment, the man stood there, staring at him, his eyes flickering with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. He wasn't used to people standing up to him. He wasn't used to people who refused to bend. He wasn't used to seeing someone who had been told they didn't belong stand tall and look him in the eye. But that was exactly what John did. The man's gaze shifted to his colleague, and they exchanged a wordless glance. It was clear that the decision had already been made. They were not going to win this battle with words. No, they had their methods. Without a word, the men stepped back, signaling for a couple of security officers to enter. But before they could act, John stood tall. His crutches were firm under his hands, his eyes locked on the men who thought they could erase him from this world. "I'm not leaving," John said again, his voice unwavering. In that moment, he felt something shift inside him. The fear, the uncertainty, the doubt, it all melted away. This wasn't about whether they would accept him. This wasn't about being liked or invited into their world. This was about reclaiming everything they had taken from him. His dignity, his pride, his right to exist as a person of value, not a token, not a problem, and he was done playing by their rules. The security officers moved toward him, but John didn't back down. He was ready for whatever came next. He had already been broken too many times in his life, but now he was whole. He was done being a victim. He was done being erased. As the officers moved closer, John took a deep breath, his mind clear. He wasn't going to fight them with violence. He was going to fight them with something more powerful, his refusal to submit, his refusal to be forgotten. The officers stopped just in front of him, but John didn't flinch. He didn't move. "I'm not your token," he said again, his voice strong and certain, "and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, the men standing before him hesitated, and in that hesitation, John knew he had won. He had fought his fight, and he had shown them who he truly was. And in that moment, he knew, no matter what happened next, they would never be able to erase him again. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What did you think of John's journey? Have you ever faced racism or struggled to be seen in your life? Your opinions matter deeply to us, and we truly value every single one of you who's part of this community. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It means a lot to us, and it helps us continue bringing you content that matters. We wish you a wonderful day ahead. And if you've listened to this until the very end, please write the phrase, "I refuse to be invisible," in the comments, so we know you're with us until the last word. Your feedback keeps us going, and we can't wait to hear from you.